February 22nd, 2026, Buddha Dhamma, chapter 17.4 and chapter 17.5, page 1589 to page 1602. 17.4, Theistic morality versus the doctrine of natural truth. 17.5, basic moral conduct. Now I want to note that we've been reading both out of the Buddha Dhamma. One is the original one, and the other one is the essential Buddha Dhamma, which is translated and edited by Bruce Evans. Here in the original form, it is in chapter 17, but in essential Buddha Dhamma is in chapter 9. Now, 17.4, theistic morality versus the doctrine of natural truth, starting in page 1589. Some scholars have criticized Buddhism for teaching in an exclusively negative way. They claim that Buddhism teaches people to solely refrain from evil, but it does not encourage people to exert themselves in the positive way by doing good. Buddhism does not advise people how to promote goodness once they have refrained from wrongdoing. Buddhism is merely a teaching of subjectivity, an ethics of abstract thinking, a teaching on resignation and passivity. They go on to say that Buddha's teaching lead Buddhists to be contented merely with avoiding evil, but they take no interest in helping other human beings find freedom from suffering and discover true happiness. These scholars claim that even though Buddhism teaches loving kindness and compassion, these qualities are confined simply to the mental activities. They draw upon passages in the Tipitaka to support their view that the Buddha's teachings are exclusively negative. Take the example, they cite the definition of right action, Samma Sankappa, presented by Venerable Sariputra. And what, friends, is Samma Sankappa, right action? Abstaining from killing living beings, abstaining from taking what is not given, abstaining from misconduct in sensual pleasures. This is called Samma Sankappa, right action. Someone who recognizes the true practical application of these factors, as in outline, for example, in the elaboration of moral conduct contained in the 10 wholesome course of actions, will see that these scholars who offer criticism, much of which is well-intentioned, surely have garnered only an incomplete knowledge and do not understand Buddha Dhamma in its entirety. It is clear that the system of virtuous conduct, sila, based on the factors of path, is not restricted to being negative, passive, subjective, or merely an ethical or ethics of abstract thinking. In any case, when one encounters such criticism, one should take the opportunity to clarify these matters within oneself and expands one's understanding. The explanations of moral factors of the path refer to the basic behavior linked with cetana, intention. They are initially defined through a terminology of negation. The example here is the definitions emphasize the refraining from evil for the following reasons. In Buddhism, moral precepts and codes of conduct are not divine edicts or commandments etched in stone, which through God's will stipulate how people should behave, often through blind faith without needing to understand the justification for moral behavior. emphasis on dogma. In Buddha Dhamma, moral precepts are determined according to the laws of nature, and collectively they constitute the beginning stage of spiritual development. Someone who upholds these precepts ought to discern the relationships of these natural laws. Although one may not yet possess a clear understanding, it may not act at the level of sattha, faith. This sattha, faith, should be well grounded. Akaravati sattha. It should be at least based on the rudimentary understanding of the cause and effect of causality, the law of karma. Enough to give rise to the increasing degrees of panya, wisdom. In the gradual development of the Dhamma practice of spiritual training, one must prepare a stable and even foundation. One begins with refraining from eliminating unwholesome actions before one cultivates goodness and eventually reaches purity and liberation. This is similar to growing a fruit tree. One must first prepare the soil by removing harmful elements. Then one is ready to plant the seed. Take care of the plant, harvest one's desired fruit. In Buddha Dhamma, sila, virtuous conduct, is the first stage of practice, samatha, or vipassana, in which the emphasis is on the refraining from unskillful actions. First, there is a repeated focus on those things that need to be eliminated, after which the boundaries of spiritual practice can be expanded by gradually including the elevated stages of concentration and wisdom. Within the systems of the threefold training, Theistic, moral conduct is itself, it's not practical leading to the highest goal. Rather, it prepares the general foundation of one's life, makes one ready to cultivate the essential factors of mental development, which is referred in the brief as concentration, or in Pali language, samadhi. Samadhi, the first stage of the development, follows on from the reaps and the benefits of moral conduct. The spiritual value of moral conduct is tremendous. The intention to refrain from evil or the absence of thoughts of wrongdoing purifies and steadies the mind. A person thus is not disturbed by confusion, distress, or anxiety. The mind becomes tranquil and concentrated. When the mind is peaceful and concentrated, one develops clarity and proficiency in wisdom. One uses reasoned discernment and seeks ways to further cultivate goodness and reach higher stages of spiritual accomplishments. Being endowed with strong, virtuous, and joyful mind, it is vital importance. In Buddhist ethics, there must be a constant link and integration between one's state of mind and one's external, physical, and verbal actions. The mind is the source of all actions. Therefore, intention, cetana, is the principal factor in determining the true sincerity of a person's virtuous deeds. Not deceiving others is an inadequate yardstick. There must also be the absence of self-deception. Developing a wholesome integration of factors uplifts the minds and prevents the problems of mental behavior and external behavior being at odds with one another. The path factor related to sila, moral conduct, revealed that the most basic form of human responsibility is to take responsibility for one's own mind, to guard against all thoughts of harming or violating others. When a person has established this basic purity of mind, personal responsibility expands outwards to sustaining and cultivating spiritual qualities and performing virtuous deeds in order to help others. In sum, there is the personal responsibility to refrain from evil and the social responsibility to act for others' well-beings and happiness. To interpret sila, moral conduct, as the refraining from harming and wrongdoing is to define this principle as a spiritual practice in a basic and uniform way. This interpretation emphasizes volition, that is completely free from corruption and wickedness. When one has achieved such a basic discipline, the freedom from affliction and turmoil, both internal and external, one can begin to expand on and cultivate aspects of wholesome and virtuous conduct. In regard to goodness, it details the methods of practice are limitless and vary according to time and place. Unskillful actions, on the other hand, can be strictly defined and determined. Take the example of both monks and lay people should refrain from telling lies. But the opportunities and the methods for undertaking wholesome activities based on honest speech may vary. The all-inclusive principles of behavior thus specify the refraining from basic forms of wrongdoing. The details and methods of cultivating goodness are matters of practical application depending on a person's life circumstances. To arrive at the goal of Buddhism, it is necessary to develop every factor of the Eightfold Path. Therefore, each path factor must be all-inclusive principle which every person is able to follow and practice, not limited to a person's social standing, time period, location, or specific surrounding condition. This is clearly evident in the domain of sila, moral conduct. The example here is to abstain from taking what is not freely given is something that every person can do. But the offering of gifts depends on the other factors, having something to give, having a recipient, and having a worthy recipient. In the case that a person does not have the opportunity to give, intention that is free from any thoughts of stealing already purifies the mind and acts as the foundation for samadhi, concentration. If one has the opportunity to give, however, this giving will increase one's virtue and prevent mental strains of being uncaring or possessive. It is for this reason that the primary interpretations of these path factors of morality, sila, exists in the form of negation, of abstaining from unskillful behavior, or the absence of evil. The expanded interpretation of these path factors, which includes the positive acts of generating goodness in the matters of practical application, as mentioned above. In the Dhamma practice, practitioners often consciously develop a specific spiritual quality or virtue. During this time, the practitioner must absorb in and focus on that activity. In such circumstances, one's responsibility concerning the areas of practice is simply to prevent harmful or unskillful conditions from arising. Here, the desired benefits from moral conduct is to help regulate others' areas of activity, to prevent ones from erring and committing an unskillful action, to be free from mental weakness and disturbance, and to prepare a firm foundation in order to develop in the chosen virtuous quality completely and resolutely. As mentioned above, the Buddhist system of spiritual training is threefold, the Titso Sikha, comprising of moral conduct, concentration, and wisdom. Moreover, it is based on the natural phenomenon. Many of the critical scholars mentioned above, however, view morality from the perspective of a theistic tradition. And thus they can make neither head nor tail of the Buddhist system. It is important to distinguish between moral conduct as taught in Buddha Dhamma and moral conduct taught in theistic religion. This analysis should include those teachings on karma, the law of causality, cause and conditions, cause and effect, and on good and evil. Here are some important points on this distinction. In the doctrine of the natural truth, Sabhava Niyama, Buddha Dhamma, principles of moral behavior are determined and defined according to the cause of laws of nature, cause and effect. In theistic religions, however, moral principles are divine commandments laid down according to the divine will of a higher source or a higher power. From the angle of negation or restraint, moral conduct in Buddha Dhamma is the principle of self-discipline and self-training. Therefore, the prescribed precepts are referred to as training rules, Sikkhapada. As for moral conduct in theistic religions, it is comprised of prohibitions, of commandments laid down from a higher power. In Buddha Dhamma, the vital factor for moral conduct is well grounded in faith, Akaravati Sattha, a trust in the natural laws and the basic understanding that your intention or volitional actions and the results proceed in according to cause and conditions. A vital factor for moral conduct in theistic religions is bhakti, devotional faith, a belief in the acceptance of and the obedience to those things prescribed by a higher source, and a complete entrusting oneself to these prescriptions without needing to question their validity. In Buddha Dhamma, a correct upholding of moral precepts entails self-discipline, beginning with the intention to refrain from all vices and followed by the development of virtues, which are diametrically opposed to such vices. In theistic religions, however, the upholding of moral precepts entails strict obedience to divine commandments from above. In Buddha Dhamma, practice on the level of sila, moral conduct, has its specific objectives of acting as a foundation for samadhi, concentration. It is part of a system of training designed to prepare and enable a person to harness the power of the mind in the greatest way possible, eventually giving rise to wisdom and leading to the end of perfect mental health or mental freedom, as saved for going to a heavenly realm. This is merely a natural consequence of causes and conditions. In theistic religions, however, upholding the commandments leads to divine favor, a reward. It is a conduct that accords with the higher source, the will of God, and results in the reward of being born in heaven or a heavenly realm. In Buddha Dhamma, the good and bad results of moral or immoral behavior occurs automatically according to its natural order. They stem from the impartial, objective functioning of the natural law, referred to as the law of karma. These are effects first manifest in the mind, and then it manifests further in a person's personality by way of life, in the lifetime and the future lifetimes. In theistic religions, however, good and bad results from keeping and transgressing divine commandments from above are matters of reward or retribution. The reward for the obedience is going to heaven. The punishment for transgression is going to hell. The reward or punishment is determined solely by divine judgment. In regard to good and evil, Buddha Dhamma teaches moral virtues, protects, enhances, purifies, and alleviates the mind. It is thus referred to as punya, or merit, virtuous. Moral conduct promotes mental prosperity, mental health. It is a skillful action. It conforms to wisdom. and it leads to liberation. Thus it is called kusala, wholesome, skillful. Wicked, immoral behavior, on the other hand, impairs or decreases the quality of mind, and thus it is called papa, evil. It damages a person's life. It is unskillful. It is conductive. It is conductive neither to mental well-being nor to liberation. Thus is called akusala, unskillful, unwholesome. In theistic religions, however, good and evil is based primarily on faith and devotion. Behavior is measured by obedience and conformity to God's will or God's commandment. Evil in particular is interpreted as behavior opposing to transgressing the will of God, commonly called sin. In Buddha Dhamma, it is imperative that teachings on morality be based on reason analysis, sound judgment. For Dhamma practitioners only conduct themselves correctly when they understand how the system of ethics is connected to the law of causality, of karma, causes and conditions. The prevailing morality of these theistic religion is based on divine proclamations and divine decree, which is comprised of desperate rules and precepts. Although these rules may be compiled into an ethical code, they are not part of an integrated system, because the follower of such religion requires only enough understanding to determine what rules have been laid down. It is not necessary to understand the entire system of the relationship of other factors, because the larger design exists in God's all-knowing wisdom. Followers ought not to doubt, but rather they should surrender themselves and follow obediently. The Buddhist system of ethics is comprised of objective and universal principles. It's determined according to the laws of nature. Here, ethics refers to the essence of sila, as the aspects of truth, dealing with good and evil. It's not referring to sila as prescribed in the code of discipline, the Vinaya, which involves forms of correction and punishment within a social setting. In theistic religions, ethical principles tend to be determined according to the divine will. The code of ethics resembled and prescribed code of discipline, or the legal code, because God is both the enactor of these laws and the judge. Buddha Dhamma teaches that specific intention or volitional actions have specific effects on a person's mind, specific effects on a person's behavior, specific effects on the person's dispositions, and specific effects on the person's personality. In this context, it is invalid to set limitations or qualification of such effects of intention or volitional action. For example, by claiming that a particular group of people have an advantage, or to use personal approval as a criterion to truth, it is invalid to make the following claims. Only members of this specific religion and compassionate and good, or are compassionate and good. But members of other religions, although they may express compassion, are not truly good. Killing people of this religion is a sin, but killing people of other religions is not a sin. Only virtuous people of this religion can go to heaven, while people of other religions, regardless of how they behave, are infidels and are destined for hell. Killing animals is not a sin, because animals are intended for food for humans. Are we not food for lions and tigers? A proper relationship to food involves the acceptance that while we are still walking on the path, we have not yet reached the goal. We must occasionally do what is undesirable, as we have no alternative. Gautama Buddha taught that to consider food in the similar way to the mother and the father who are forced to eat the flesh of their deceased children, who has died along the desert track. Having said this, is it valid, however, to distinguish between different kinds of intentions or volitional actions? For instance, by observing how various degrees of unskillful behavior affects the functioning of the mind. Because moral conduct is based on objective principles and determined according to the natural laws. Buddhist practitioners require courage and honesty to acknowledge, enforce, and face the truth. They are urged to accept truth of conditions, that good and evil, right and wrong, exist within themselves and within the world. Whether people practice according or not, and to the extent that they practice, is another matter. People need to acknowledge whether they are acting in conformity with these natural laws or not. They should not consider an evil deed as good simply because it accords with their desires. The validity of natural laws governing human behavior does not depend on people's desires. If one is about to perform an action that results in falling into the hellish realm, it is better to acknowledge that this action is bad, but that one is still willing to suffer the consequences, than to delude oneself into thinking that one is doing nothing wrong. Admittedly, there are some benefits or advantages to an ethics based on divine mandate. First, it cuts off the need to debate whether an action is correct or incorrect, true or false. Unquestioned belief and devotional faith often generate ardent effort and quick results in spiritual practice, but it also tends to create problems. The examples are problems about what should be done in order to instill faith in people, especially in this age of reason. Problems about how to live at peace with other people who do not share one's belief. The problems of how to sustain faith and to diminish opportunity for people to exercise their wisdom faculty freely. Some of these problems can be overlooked if one is content for human society to be split into divergent groups. Ordinary people tend to find a moral system based on faith and devotion more accessible. And this kind of moral system does a good job at regulating ordinary people's behavior. Even among many Buddhists, the understanding of sila in relation to good and evil harbors beliefs that resemble those of theistic religions. For example, to view ethics as a set of prohibitions, but only an obscure idea of who prohibits, as opposed to theistic doctrines, which clearly state that God prohibits. And to view the results of good and evil as a form of reward or punishment. The problem with such a system, however, is that it relies primarily on faith. It can provide people with moral loopholes by determining unwholesome actions as innocent or innocuous. People may justify them in order to gain something for themselves. Take the example of the negation or the notion that killing animals is not a sin, which assumes people's sense of guilt and makes them feel blameless. Although convincing oneself of one's innocence can be effective, it has adverse effect in other areas of one's life. It does not accord with the path of wisdom. Buddha Dhamma encourages people to have a clear awareness of the truth at every stage of spiritual practice. It is able to determine and judge the truth for themselves. It teaches people to use methods of self-motivation and independent action, which includes thorough understanding of the factors involved. These methods of self-motivation should be harmless and only be used as a support for generating other spiritual qualities. 17.5. Basic Moral Conduct, page 1598. It is important to recognize some general principles that assist in the proper practice of moral conduct at all levels that enable one to practice the Dhamma correctly. Dhamma pati pati. Gautama's Buddha's defining the path factors of right speech, right action, and right livelihood reveal the essence of sila. They describe the necessary guidelines of moral conduct required by virtuous life. Teachers from ancient times later compiled the 8 subsidiary factors of moral conduct derived from these 3 path factors. They called them by the name of the set of the 8 precepts, which pure livelihood is the 8 Ajiva Kammata Sila. These are the essential factors of moral conduct. From here, the analysis of moral conduct branches out. For example, when one describes a training for specific groups of people with a distinctive way of life, with distinct objective and course of development, one may distinguish various details of practice, as the moral conduct for monks, for nuns, for novices, for the laities, etc. Moreover, a clear system of communal management may be established, referred to as moral discipline, the Vinaya, which includes measures for restraint, administration, enacting of penalties or transgressions, etc. Gautama Buddha's words on the path factors of moral conduct reveal that the path is not intended only for the community of monks. Otherwise, the definition of sila would be the 220 precepts of virtuous conduct for bhikkhus, bhikkhu sila, the morality of renunciants, bhapa citta sila, or something along these lines. Gautama Buddha taught the essence of moral conduct in the way that incorporates diverse and detailed moral principles and precepts. It was not necessary for him to bestow formal titles on some of these subsidiary guidelines for conduct. For example, he mentioned the 5 precepts, the 8 precepts, and the 10 precepts without giving them explicit names, because it was often forgotten. It should be emphasized that sila does not refer only to virtual physical or verbal action, but also includes the pure and virtuous livelihood. The way one earns a living has an important bearing on virtuous conduct. In the Tipitaka classification of moral precepts, normally only the main subjects are mentioned: to refrain from destroying living creatures, to refrain from stealing. By glancing at these main subjects, one may only see in a negative or a negating light. To gain a complete and clear understanding of these precepts, one needs to look at Gautama Buddha's words elaborating on their meanings. In the teaching on the 10 wholesome courses of action, Kusala Kamma Pata, for instance, one sees that almost every factor is divided into 2 parts. There is an aspect to be refrained from and an aspect to be performed. A negating quality is followed by a positive quality. The teaching begins with abstaining from evil action, killing, followed by the encouragement to perform good actions that opposes unskillful action, compassionately assisting all living creatures. The path consists of moral conduct, concentration, and wisdom, which must be fully integrated in order for the fruits of the path to be achieved. Although here the discussion focuses on moral conduct, one needs to be aware that it is merely one stage of an integrated process. When one advances on the path, moral conduct must be linked with the other 2 path factors in order to reach true success. Technically speaking, the fulfillment and perfection resulting from the complete integration of the path factors is called the unity of spiritual qualities, Dhamma Sammaki. Even the highest level of complete awakening, there must be this integration of factors. When one gains an appreciation of this integration of factors, although one may be focusing on the factors pertaining to moral conduct, and be aware of the remaining factors and the role that they play. The teaching on the 10 wholesome courses of action expands on the factors in the way that may be applied to all human beings. These 10 factors are described as the factors leading to true harmony. Manusa Dhamma. It is evident that the teaching of moral conduct is accompanied by mental and wisdom development. The first 7 factors, Sambojana, pertain to moral conduct. Factors 8 and 9 pertain to the concentration, and the 10th factor pertains to wisdom. The 5 precepts, however, which is considered the most basic form of acceptable moral conduct, encompasses the stage of Sila, not Samadhi or Panya. Teso Sika, Sila, Samadhi, Panya. This indicates the 5 precepts alone were inadequate for truly advancing on the Buddhist path. When one is unable to develop the higher spiritual qualities, at the very least, one should abstain from wickedness and try not to seriously harm others. Having said thus, the 5 precepts are not excluded from unity from spiritual factors. Dhamma Samakhi. In those circumstances when one was appropriate to distinguish moral conduct as a distinct category, Gautama Buddha would prepare the commentary teachings containing factors pertaining to the mind and wisdom. Here there are 3 factors that are not placed together in a single group as they are in the 10 wholesome courses of action. He would teach those lay people who begun their spiritual practice by upholding the 5 precepts to complete their training, by developing the mind and wisdom so that they may become awakened disciples. This alternative presentation of integrated spiritual factors is used as the teaching specifically for householders. Usually contains 4 factors: faith, virtuous conduct, generosity, and wisdom. Occasionally the 5th factors of learning is added. This group of factors is mentioned very adequately in the Tipitaka. Here is a concise summary of the teaching. After mentioning the means by which one gains victory over the world, by properly managing one's home, domestic help, financial earnings, etc., which are matters pertaining to immediate benefits, Ditta Dhammikata, Gautama Buddha speaks about the means by which one gains victory in the world to come, pertaining to future benefits. Now here is what Gautama Buddha tells one of the lay disciples, Visakha, of 4 qualities. A woman practiced for victory in the next world that makes ready for the next world. What are the 4? And how is a woman accomplished in faith? Sattha. Here a woman is endowed in sattha. She is conviction in the awakening of the Taka Kata Bodhisattva. Thus the Blessed One is an Arihat. Second, how is a woman accomplished by virtuous conduct? Sila. Here a woman abstains from the destruction of life, from taking what is not given, from sexual misconduct, from false speech, from spirits intoxicant, the basis for heedlessness, apamado. Third, and how is a woman accomplished in generosity? Shakha. Here is a woman dwells in the home and the heart devoid to abstain from misery, freely generous, open-handed, delighting in relinquishment, devoted in clarity, delighting in giving and sharing. How is a woman accomplished in wisdom? Panya. Here a woman is wise. She possesses the wisdom and discerns, arising and passing away, which is noble and penetrates and leads to the complete destruction of suffering. The 5th factor, which is desirable but not imperative, is learning, sutta. Learning by way of formal education, reading, listening, etc., which refers to acquiring raw data for knowledge. If one develops great learning, Bahu Sutta, this is even more adventurous. Many Buddhists are concerned only with moral conduct. They may be aware of other aspects of the teaching, but but their knowledge is often confused and unsystematic. Even though Gautama Buddha clearly outlined the complete spiritual development of Ditso Sika, the training of Sila, the training of Samadhi, and the training of Panya, he reiterated how householders should be endowed with sattva, faith, moral conduct, Sila, specifically of the 5 precepts, learning, Sutta, generosity, Sakha, wisdom, Panya. When one reaches the unity of spiritual factor at this level, the noble path, Arya Magga, is accessible for cultivation. The Pali term Sila has a very broad scope of meaning. It can be used in very specific contexts or in a general sense. As mentioned earlier, it is important to be able to distinguish this term from the term Vinaya. Principles of Dharma should be divided into 3 factors of moral conduct: concentration and wisdom. Concentration and wisdom pertain exclusively to the law of Dhamma, whereas moral conduct may be divided into the principles of the law of Dhamma, also into the conventional disciplinary code, the Vinaya. The Vinaya is one aspect of Sila, on the level of Dhamma and Sila, and on the level of Vinaya. Following some of the teachings by Gautama Buddha summarizes basic moral principles in relation to ordinary people, and clarifying the meaning and the essence of the term Sila. That's the end of chapter 17.5, Basic Principles of Moral Conduct. At the bottom of page 1602, Buddha Dhamma.